You're listening to The Cultured Bumpkin, a literature podcast with Jake Phillips, where we present audiobook quality readings of the classics for your enjoyment. Thank you for stopping by. And remember, just because you're a bumpkin doesn't mean you can't be cultured. Hello and welcome to The Cultured Bumpkin. I'm Jake. On this episode, I'm going to give you a compilation of several stories, 2 hours worth of stories that we've done in the past. Most of them over the past year. Some of them were before that. But anyway, this would be perfect for road tripping or that kind of thing. But also, I've been very busy on my YouTube channel. I do a lot of live streaming of poetry. I do poetry readings, and then I do classic book readings. Right now I'm reading through Jane Austen in Southern, and that's kind of a fun combination. I've gotten a lot of people from especially Ireland and England that they're like, man, we like this. And so that's always fun. But anyway, I'll leave a link in the show notes that you can check out that if you want to. But do enjoy this compilation of classic American short stories. The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend Leonidas W. Smiley as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, and that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decayed mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me a good day. I told him a friend had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with a chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that so far from his imagining there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. I let him go on in his own way and never interrupted him once. Reverend Leonidas W. H.M., Reverend Lewell. There was a fella here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of 49, or maybe it was the spring of 50. I don't recollect exactly. Somehow, though, what makes me think it was one or the other is I remember the big flume weren't varnished when he first came to the camp, but anyway, he was the curiousest man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't change sides. Anyway, that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so he's got a bet, he was satisfied. But still he was lucky, uncommon lucky. He most always come out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned but that feller's offered a bet on it, and take any side you please, as I was telling you. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. If there was two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. If there was a camp meeting, he would be the regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here, and he was, too, and a good man. If he ever see a straddlebug start to go anywhere, he'd bet you how long it would take him to get to wherever he was going. And if you took him up, he would follow that straddlebug to Mexico, but what he would find out where he was bound for and how long he was on the road. Lots of boys here have seen that Smiley and can tell you about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He'd bet on anything. The dangdest fella. Parson Walker's wife laid very sick once for a good while, and it seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning, he come in, and Smiley up and asked him how she was, and he said she was considerable better, thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart that the blessing of Providence she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, "Well, I'll risk 2.5 she don't anyway." This year Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only fun, because of course she was faster than that. And he used to win money on that horse, for all she was slow and always had the asthma, or the distemper, or the consumption, or something of the kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start and then pass her underway. But always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate-like and come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air, sometimes out to one side among the fences, and kicking up the more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead and near as you could cipher it down. And he had this little small bull pup that when you look at him, you'd think he weren't worth a cent, but set around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up, he was a different dog. His underjaw would begin to stick out like the forecastle of a steamship. His teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces. And the dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on, but he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up. And then, all of a sudden, he would grab that other dog just by the giant of his hind leg and freeze to it, not chaw, you understand. He would just grip it and hang on until they throwed up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always come out a winner on that pup, till he was harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs because they'd been sawed off in a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along far enough and the money was all up and he come to make a snatch for his pet Holt, he seen a minute how he'd been imposed on and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak. He appeared surprised, and then he looked sort of discouraged like and didn't try no more to win the fight, and so he got shucked out bad. He gave Smiley a look as such to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault for putting a dog in there that had no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight. And then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. He was a good pup, that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he'd have lived, for the stuff in him he had was genius. I know because he had no opportunities to speak of. And it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he had no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his'n and the way it turned out. Well, this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kind of things till you couldn't rest and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day and took him home. And he calculated to educate him. And so he never done nothing for 3 months but sat in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn to jump too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. Seen him turn a somersault, maybe a couple, if he had a good start, and then come down flat-footed and all right, like a cat. He got him up so in a matter of catching flies and kept him in the practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as he could see him. Smiley said all a frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I'd seen him set Daniel Webster down there on this floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the dog. And sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies." And quicker than you could wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off in the counter there and flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud and start scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he hadn't any idea he was doing any more than a frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand. And when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well might he be, for fellers that had traveled and been everywhere all said he laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp he was, come across him with his box and says, "What might that be you got in that box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot or it might be a canary maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it careful and turned it around this way and that and says, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can out-jump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and took another long, particular look and gave it back to Smiley and says, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no pints about the frog that's any better than other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand 'em. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can out-jump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a moment, and then he says, kind of sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, that's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go get you a frog." And so the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him up full of quail shot, filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley, he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he catched a frog and fetched him in and gave him to this feller and says, "Now if you're ready, set him alongside of Daniel with his 4 paws just even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, 1, 2, 3, get! And him and the other fella touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively. But Daniel give a heave and hoisted up his shoulders so like a Frenchman, but weren't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church, and he couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out at the doctor, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulder so at Daniel and says, again, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no pints about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and at last says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He 'pears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Daniel up by the nape of the neck and hefted him and said, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds. And he turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And when he see how it was, he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took out after that feller, but he never catched him. And here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, and he got up to see what was wanted. And turning to see me as he moved away, he said, "Just set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't gonna be gone a second." By your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. "Well, this here Smiley had a yaller one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and however, lacking both time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave." The Cop and the Anthem by O. Henry. On his bench in Madison Square, Soapy moved uneasily. When wild geese honk high of nights, and when women without sealskin coats grow kind to their husbands, and when Soapy moves uneasily on his bench in the park, you may know that winter is near at hand. A dead leaf fell in Soapy's lap. That was Jack Frost's card. Jack is kind to the regular denizens of Madison Square and gives fair warning of his annual call. At the corners of 4 streets, he hands his pasteboard to the north wind, footman of the mansion of all outdoors, so that the inhabitants thereof may make ready. Soapy's mind became cognizant of the fact that the time had come for him to resolve himself into a singular committee of ways and means to provide against the coming rigor, and therefore he moved uneasily on his bench. The hibernatorial ambitions of Soapy were not of the highest. In them there were no considerations of Mediterranean cruises, of soporific southern skies drifting in the Vesuvian Bay. 3 months on the island was what his soul craved. 3 months of assured board and bed and congenial company, safe from Boreas and bluecoats, seemed to Soapy the essence of things desirable. For years the hospitable Blackwells had been his winter quarters, just as his more fortunate fellow New Yorkers had bought their tickets to Palm Beach and the Riviera each winter. So Soapy had made his humble arrangements for his annual hegira to the island. And now the time was come. On the previous night, 3 Sabbath newspapers, distributed beneath his coat, about his ankles, and over his lap, had failed to repulse the cold as he slept on his bench near the spurting fountain in the ancient square. So the island loomed big and timely in Soapy's mind. He scorned the provisions made in the name of charity for the city's dependents. In Soapy's opinion, the law was more benign than philanthropy. There was an endless round of institutions, municipal and eleemosynary, on which he might set out and receive lodging and food accordant with the simple life. But to one of Soapy's proud spirit, the gifts of charity are encumbered. If not in coin, you must pay in humiliation of spirit for every benefit received at the hands of philanthropy. As Caesar had his Brutus, every bed of charity must have its toll of a bath, every loaf of bread its compensation of a private and personal inquisition. Wherefore it is better to be a guest of the law, which, though conducted by rules, does not meddle unduly with a gentleman's private affairs. Soapy, having decided to go to the island, at once set about accomplishing his desire. There were many easy ways of doing this. The pleasantest was to dine luxuriously at some expensive restaurant, and then, after declaring insolvency, be handed over quietly and without uproar to a policeman. An accommodating magistrate would do the rest. Soapy left his bench and strolled out of the square and across the level sea of asphalt where Broad and Fifth Avenue flow together. Up Broadway he turned and halted at a glittering cafe, where are gathered together nightly the choicest products of the grape, the silkworm, and the protoplasm. Soapy had confidence in himself from the lowest button of his vest upward. He was shaven, and his coat was decent, and his neat black, ready-tied four-in-hand had been presented to him by a lady missionary on Thanksgiving Day. If he could reach a table in the restaurant unsuspected, success would be his. The portion of him that would show above the table would raise no doubt in the waiter's mind. A roasted mallard duck, thought Soapy, would be about the thing, with a bottle of Chablis, and then Camembert, a demitasse, and a cigar. $1 for the cigar would be enough. The total would not be so high as to call forth any supreme manifestation of revenge from the cafe management, and yet the meat would leave him filled and happy for the journey to his winter refuge. but as Soapy set foot inside the restaurant door, the head waiter's eye fell upon his frayed trousers and decadent shoes. Strong and ready hands turned him about and conveyed him in silence and haste to the sidewalk and averted the ignoble fate of the menaced mallard. Soapy turned off Broadway. It seemed that his route to the coveted island was not to be an Epicurean one. Some other way of entering limbo must be thought of. At a corner of 6th Avenue, electric lights and cunningly displayed wares behind plate glass made a shop window conspicuous. Soapy took a cobblestone and dashed it through the glass. People came running around the corner, a policeman in the lead. Soapy stood still, with his hands in his pockets, and smiled at the sight of brass buttons. "Where's the man that done that?" inquired the officer excitedly. "Don't you figure out that I might have had something to do with it?" said Soapy, not without sarcasm, but friendly, as one greets good fortune. The policeman's mind refused to accept Soapy even as a clue. Men who smash windows do not remain to parley with the law's minions. They take to their heels. The policeman saw a man halfway down the block running to catch a car. With drawn club, he joined in the pursuit. Soapy, with disgust in his heart, loafed along, twice unsuccessful. On the opposite side of the street was a restaurant of no great pretensions. It catered to large appetites and modest purses. Its crockery and atmosphere were thick, its soup and napery thin. Into this place Soapy took his accuse of shoes and telltale trousers without challenge. At a table he sat and consumed beefsteak, flapjacks, doughnuts, and pie. And then to the waiter be betrayed the fact that the minutest coin and himself were strangers. "Now get busy and call a cop," said Soapy, "and don't keep a gentleman waitin'." "No cop for yous," said the waiter, with a voice like butter cakes and an eye like the cherry in a Manhattan cocktail. "Hey, Con." Neatly upon his left ear on the callous pavement, 2 waiters pinched Soapy. He arose, joint by joint, as a carpenter's rule opens, and beat the dust from his clothes. Arrest seemed but a rosy dream. The island seemed very far away. A policeman who stood before a drugstore 2 doors away laughed and walked down the street. 5 blocks Soapy traveled before his courage permitted him to woo capture again. This time the opportunity presented what he fatuously termed to himself a cinch. A young woman of a modest and pleasing guise was standing before a show window, gazing with sprightly interest at its display of shaving mugs and inkstands, and 2 yards from the window a large policeman of severe demeanor leaned against a water plug. It was Soapy's design to assume the role of the despicable and execrated masher. The refined and elegant appearance of his victim and the contiguity of the conscientious cop encouraged him to believe that he would soon feel the pleasant official clutch upon his arm that would ensure his winter quarters on the tight little aisle. Soapy straightened the lady missionary's ready-made tie, dragged his shrinking cuffs into the open, set his hat at a killing cant, and sidled toward the young woman. He made eyes at her, was taken with sudden coughs and hms, smiled, smirked, and went brazenly through the impudent and contemptible litany of the masher. With half an eye, Soapy saw that the policeman was watching him fixedly. The young woman moved away a few steps, and again bestowed her absorbed attention upon the shaving mugs. Soapy followed, boldly stepping to her side, raised his hat, and said, "Ah, there, Bedelia. Don't you want to come and play in my yard?" The policeman was still looking. The persecuted young woman had but to beckon a finger, and Soapy would be practically en route for his insular haven. Already he imagined he could feel the cozy warmth of the station house. The young woman faced him, and stretching out a hand, caught Soapy's coat sleeve. "Sure, Mike," she said joyfully. "If you'll blow me to a pail of suds, I'd have spoke to you sooner, but the cop was watching." With the young woman playing the clinging ivy to his oak, Soapy walked past the policeman, overcome with gloom. He seemed doomed to liberty. At the next corner he shook off his companion and ran. He halted in the district where by night are found the lightest streets, hearts, vows, and librettos. Women in furs and men in greatcoats moved gaily in the wintry air. A sudden fear seized Soapy that some dreadful enchantment had rendered him immune to arrest. The thought brought a little panic upon it, and when he came upon another policeman lounging grandly in front of a transplendent theater, he caught at the immediate straw of disorderly conduct. On the sidewalk, Soapy began to yell drunken gibberish at the top of his harsh voice. He danced, howled, raved, and otherwise disturbed the welkin. The policeman twirled his club, turned his back to Soapy, and remarked to a citizen, "'Tis one of them Yale lads celebrating the goose egg they give to the Hartford College. Noisy, but no harm. We've instructions to leave 'em be." Disconsolate, Soapy ceased his unavailing racket. Would never a policeman lay hands on him? In his fancy, the island seemed an unattainable Arcadia. He buttoned his thin coat against the chilling wind. In a cigar store, he saw a well-dressed man lighting a cigar at a swinging light. His silk umbrella he had set by the door on entering. Soapy stepped inside, secured the umbrella, and sauntered off with it slowly. The man at the cigar light followed hastily. "My umbrella," he said sternly. "Oh, is it?" sneered Soapy, adding insult to petty larceny. "Well, why don't you call a policeman? I took it, your umbrella. Why don't you call a cop? There stands one on the corner." The umbrella owner slowed his steps. Soapy did likewise, with a presentiment that luck would again run against him. The policeman looked at the two curiously. "Of course," said the umbrella man. "That is, well, you know how these mistakes occur. If it's your umbrella, I hope you'll excuse me. I picked it up this morning in a restaurant. If you recognize it as yours, why, I hope you'll—" "Of course it's mine," said Soapy viciously. The ex-umbrella man retreated. The policeman hurried to assist a tall blonde in an opera cloak across the street in front of a streetcar that was approaching 2 blocks away. Soapy walked eastward through a street damaged by improvements. He hurled the umbrella wrathfully into an excavation. He muttered against the men who wear helmets and carry clubs. Because he wanted to fall into their clutches, they seemed to regard him as a king who could do no wrong. At length, Soapy reached one of the avenues to the east where the glitter and turmoil was but faint. He set his face down this toward Madison Square, for the homing instinct survives even when the home is a park bench. But on an unusually quiet corner, Soapy came to a standstill. Here was an old church, quaint and rambling and gabled. Through one violet-stained window a soft light glowed, where, no doubt, the organist loitered over the keys, making sure of his mastery of the coming Sabbath anthem. For there drifted out to Soapy's ears sweet music that caught and held him transfixed against the convolutions of the iron fence. The moon was above, lustrous and serene. Vehicles and pedestrians were few. Sparrows twittered sleepily in the eaves. For a little while the scene might have been a country churchyard, and the anthem that the organist played cemented Soapy to the iron fence, for he had known it well in the days when his life contained such things as mothers and roses and ambitions and friends and immaculate thoughts and collars. The conjunction of Soapy's receptive state of mind and the influences about the old church wrought a sudden and wonderful change in his soul. He viewed with swift horror the pit into which he had tumbled, the degraded days, unworthy desires, dead hopes, wrecked faculties, and base motives that made up his existence. And also, in a moment, his heart responded thrillingly to this novel mood. An instantaneous and strong impulse moved him to battle with his desperate fate. He would pull himself out of the mire. He would make a man of himself again. He would conquer the evil that had taken possession of him. There was time. He was comparatively young yet. He would resurrect his old eager ambitions and pursue them without faltering. Those solemn but sweet organ notes had set up a revolution in him. Tomorrow he would go into the roaring downtown district and find work. A fur importer had once offered him a place as driver. He would find him tomorrow and ask for the position. He would be somebody in the world. Soapy felt a hand laid on his arm. He looked quickly around into the broad face of a policeman. "What are you doing here?" asked the officer. "Nothing," said Soapy. "And come along," said the policeman. 3 months on the island," said the magistrate in the police court the next morning. Journalism in Tennessee by Mark Twain. I was told by the physician that a southern climate would improve my health, and so I went down to Tennessee and got a berth on the Morning Glory and Johnson County War Whoop as associate editor. When I went on duty, I found the chief editor sitting tilted back in a three-legged chair with his feet on a pine table. There was another pine table in the room and another afflicted chair, and both were half buried under newspapers and scraps and sheets of manuscript. There was a wooden box of sand sprinkled with cigar stubs and old soldiers, and a stove with a door hanging by its upper hinge. The chief editor had a long-tailed black cloth frock coat on and white linen pants. His boots were small and neatly blacked. He wore a ruffled shirt, a large seal ring, a standing collar of obsolete pattern, and a checkered neckerchief with the ends hanging down. Date of costume about 1848. This is like 25 years before that. Very out of date. This is like if someone was wearing a tie-dyed t-shirt and a bandana around their head. He was smoking a cigar and trying to think of a word, and in pawing his hair he had rumpled his locks a good deal. He was scowling fearfully, and I judged that he was concocting a particularly naughty editorial. He told me to take up the exchanges and skim through them and write up the spirit of the Tennessee press, condensing into the article all of their contents that seemed of interest. I wrote as follows. Spirit of the Tennessee press. The editors of the semi-weekly Earthquake evidently labor under a misapprehension with regard to the Dallyhack Railroad. It is not the object of the company to leave Buzzardville off to one side. On the contrary, they consider it one of the most important points along the line, and consequently can have no desire to slight it. The gentlemen of the Earthquake will, of course, take pleasure in making the correction. John W. Blossom, Esquire, the able editor of the Higginsville Thunderbolt and Battle Cry of Freedom, arrived in city yesterday. He is stopping at the Van Buren House. We observe that our contemporary of the Mud Springs Morning Howl has fallen into the error of supposing that the election of Van Werter is not an established fact, but he will have discovered his mistake before this remainder reaches him, no doubt. He was doubtless misled by incomplete election returns. It is pleasant to note that the city of Blathersville is endeavoring to contract with some New York gentlemen to pave its well-nigh impassable streets with the Nicholson pavement. The Daily Hurrah urges the measure with ability and seems confident of ultimate success. I passed my manuscript over to the chief editor for acceptance, alteration, or destruction. He glanced at it and his face clouded. He ran his eyes down the pages and his countenance grew portentous. It was easy to see that something was wrong. Presently he sprang up and said, "Thunder and lightning, do you suppose I'm going to speak to those cattle that way? Do you suppose my subscribers are going to stand such gruel as that? Give me that pen." I never saw a pen scrape and scratch its way so viciously, or plow through another man's verbs and adjectives so relentlessly. While he was in the midst of his work, somebody shot at him through the open window and marred the symmetry of my ear. "Ah," he said, "that is that scoundrel Smith of the Moro volcano. He was due yesterday." And he snatched a Navy revolver from his belt and fired. Smith dropped, shot in the thigh. The shot spoiled Smith's aim, who was taking a chance, and he crippled a stranger. It was me. Merely a finger shot off. Then the chief editor went on with his erasure and interlineations. Just as he finished them, a hand grenade came down the stovepipe, and the explosion shivered the stove into 1,000 fragments. However, it did no further damage, except that a vagrant piece knocked a couple of my teeth out. "That stove is utterly ruined," said the chief editor. I said I believed it was. "Well, no matter. Don't want it in this kind of weather. I know the man that did it. I'll get him. Now here's the way this stuff ought to be written." I took the manuscript. It was scarred with erasures and interlineations till its mother wouldn't have known it if it had had one. It now read as follows. Spirit of the Tennessee Press. The inveterate liars of the semi-weekly Earthquake are evidently endeavoring to palm off upon a noble and chivalrous people another of their vile and brutal falsehoods with regard to that most glorious conception of the 19th century, the Ballyhack Railroad. The idea that Buzzardville was to be left off at one side originated in their own fulsome brains, or rather in the settlings which they regard as brains. They had better swallow this lie if they want to save their abandoned reptile carcasses the cowhiding they so richly deserve. That ass Blossom of the Higginsville Thunderbolt and Battle Cry of Freedom is down here again sponging at the Van Buren. We observe that the besotted blackguard of the Mud Springs Morning Howl is given out, with his usual propensity for lying, that Van Werter is not elected. The heaven-born mission of journalism is to disseminate truth, to eradicate error, to educate, refine, and elevate the tone of public morals and manners, and make all men more gentle, more virtuous, more charitable, and in all ways better and holier and happier. And yet this black-hearted scoundrel degrades his great office persistently to the dissemination of falsehood, calumny, vituperation, and vulgarity. Blathersville wants a Nicholson pavement. It wants a jailhouse and a poorhouse more. The idea of a pavement in a one-horse town composed of 2 gin mills, a blacksmith shop, and that mustard plaster of a newspaper, the Daily Hurrah. The crawling insect Buckner, who edits the Hurrah, is braying about his business with his customary imbecility and imagining that he is talking sense. Now that is the way to write, peppery and to the point. Mush and milk journalism gives me the fantods. About this time, a brick came through the window with a splintering crash and gave me a considerable jolt in the back. I moved out of range. I began to feel in the way. The chief said, "That was the colonel, likely. I've been expecting him for 2 days. He'll be up now right away." He was correct. The colonel appeared in the door a moment afterward with a dragoon revolver in his hand. He said, "Sir, have I the honor of addressing the poltroon who edits this mangy sheet?" "You have, sir. Be seated, sir. Be careful of the chair. One of its legs is gone. I believe I have the honor of addressing the putrid liar, Colonel Blatherskite Tecumseh." "Right, sir, and I have a little account to settle with you. If you are at leisure, we will begin. I have an article on the encouraging progress of moral and intellectual development in America to finish, but there's no hurry. Begin." Both pistols rang out their fierce clamor at the same instant. The chief lost a lock of his hair, and the colonel's bullet ended its career in the fleshy part of my thigh. The colonel's left shoulder was clipped a little. They fired again. Both missed their men this time, but I got my share, a shot in the arm. At the third fire, both gentlemen were wounded slightly, and I had a knuckle chipped. I then said I believed I would go out and take a walk, as this was a private matter, and I had a delicacy about participating in it further. But both gentlemen begged me to keep my seat and assured me that I was not in the way. They then talked about the elections and the crops while they reloaded, and I fell to tying up my wounds. But presently they opened fire again with animation, and every shot took effect. But it is proper to remark that 5 out of the 6 fell to my share. The 6th one mortally wounded the colonel, who remarked with fine humor that he would have to say good morning now, as he had business uptown. He then inquired the way to the undertaker's and left. The chief turned to me and said, "I'm expecting company to dinner and shall have to get ready. It will be a favor to me if you will read proof and attend to the customers." I winced a little at the idea of attending to the customers, but I was too bewildered by the fusillade that was still ringing in my ears to think of anything to say. He continued, "Jones will be here at 3. Cowhide him. Gillespie will call earlier, perhaps. Throw him out the window. Ferguson will be along about 4. Kill him. That is all for today, I believe. If you have any odd time, you may write a blistering article on the police. Give the chief inspector rats. The cowhides are under the table, weapons in the drawer, ammunition there in the corner, lint and bandages up there in the pigeonholes. In case of accident, go to Lancet, the surgeon downstairs. He advertises. We take it out in trade." He was gone. I shuddered. At the end of the next 3 hours, I had been through perils so awful that all peace of mind and all cheerfulness were gone from me. Gillespie had called and thrown me out the window. Jones arrived promptly, and when I got ready to do the cowhiding, he took the job off my hands. In an encounter with a stranger, not in the bill of fare, I had lost my scalp. Another stranger, by the name of Thompson, left me a mere wreck and ruin of chaotic rags. And at last, at bay in the corner and beset by an infuriated mob of editors, blacklegs, politicians, and desperadoes who raved and swore and flourished their weapons about my head till the air shimmered with glancing flashes of steel, I was in the act of resigning my berth on the paper when the chief arrived, and with him a rabble of charmed and enthusiastic friends. Then ensued a scene of riot and carnage such as no human pen or steel one either could describe. People were shot, probed, dismembered, blown up, thrown out the window. There was a brief tornado of murky blasphemy with a confused and frantic war dance glimmering through it, and then all was over. In 5 minutes there was silence, and the gory chief and I sat alone and surveyed the sanguinary ruin that strewed the floor around us. He said, "You'll like this place when you get used to it." I said, "I'll have to get you to excuse me. I think maybe I'll write to suit you after a while. As soon as I had some practice and learned the language, I am confident I could. But to speak the plain truth, that sort of energy of expression has its inconveniences, and a man is liable to interruption. You see that yourself. Vigorous writing is calculated to elevate the public, no doubt, but then I do not like to attract so much attention as it calls forth. I can't write with comfort when I am interrupted so much as I have been today. I like this berth well enough, but I don't like to be left here to wait on the customers. The experiences are novel, I grant you, and entertaining, too, after a fashion, but they are not judiciously distributed. A gentleman shoots at you through the window and cripples me. A bombshell comes down the stovepipe for your gratification and sends the stove door down my throat. A friend drops in to swap compliments with you and freckles me with bullet holes till my skin won't hold my principles. You go to dinner and Jones comes with his cowhide. Gillespie throws me out the window. Thompson tears all my clothes off, and an entire stranger takes my scalp with the easy freedom of an old acquaintance. And in less than 5 minutes, all the blackguards in the county arrive in their war paint and proceed to scare the rest of me to death with their tomahawks. Take it all together, I never had such a spirited time in all my life as I have had today. No, I like you, and I like your calm, unruffled way of explaining things to the customers, but you see, I am not used to it. The Southern heart is too impulsive. Southern hospitality is too lavish with the stranger. The paragraphs which I have written today, and into whose cold sentences your masterly hand has infused the fervent spirit of Tennessee journalism, will wake up another nest of hornets. All that mob of editors will come, and they will come hungry, too, and want somebody for breakfast. I shall have to bid you adieu. I decline to be present at these festivities. I came south for my health. I will go back on the same errand, and suddenly. Tennessee journalism is too stirring for me. After which we parted with mutual regret, and I took apartments at the hospital. A Call Loan by O. Henry. In those days, the cattlemen were the anointed. They were the grandees of the grass, kings of the kine, lords of the lea, barons of beef and bone. They might have ridden in golden chariots had their taste so inclined. The cattleman was caught in a stampede of dollars. It seemed to him that he had more money than was decent. But when he had bought a watch with precious stones set in the case so large that they hurt his ribs, and a California saddle with silver nails and Angora skin suaderos, and ordered everybody up to the bar for a whiskey, what else was there for him to spend money for? Not so circumscribed in the expedient for the reduction of surplus wealth were those lairds of the lariat who had womenfolk to their name. In the breast of the rib-sprung sex, the genius of purse-lightening may slumber through years of inopportunity, but never, my brothers, does it become extinct. So out of the chaparral came Long Bill Longley from the Bar Circle branch on the Frio, a wife-driven man, to taste the urban joys of success. Something like $500,000 he had, with an income steadily increasing. Long Bill was a graduate of the camp and trail. Luck and thrift, a cool head, and a telescopic eye for mavericks had raised him from cowboy to be a cowman. Then came the boom in cattle, and Fortune, stepping gingerly among the cactus thorns, came and emptied her cornucopia at the doorstep of the ranch. In the little frontier city of Chaparosa, Longley built a costly residence. Here he became a captive, bound to the chariot of social existence. He was doomed to become a leading citizen. He struggled for a time like a mustang in his first corral, and then he hung up his quirt and spurs. Time hung heavily on his hands. He organized the First National Bank of Chaparosa and was elected its president. One day, a dyspeptic man wearing double magnifying glasses inserted an official-looking card between the bars of the cashier's window of the First National Bank. 5 minutes later, the bank force was dancing at the beck and call of a national bank examiner. This examiner, Mr. J. Edgar Todd, proved to be a thorough one. At the end of it all, the examiner put on his hat and called the president, Mr. William R. Longley, into the private office. "Well, how do you find things?" asked Longley in his slow, deep tones. "Any brands in the roundup you didn't like the looks of?" "The bank checks up all right, Mr. Longley," said Todd, "and I find your loans in very good shape, with one exception. You are carrying one very bad bit of paper, one that is so bad that I have been thinking that you surely do not realize the serious position it places you in. I refer to a call loan of $10,000 made to Thomas Merwin. Not only is the amount in excess of the maximum sum the bank can loan any individual legally, but it is absolutely without endorsement or security. Thus you have doubly violated the national banking laws and laid yourself open to criminal prosecution by the government. A report of the matter to the comptroller of the currency, which I am bound to make, would, I am sure, result in the matter being turned over to the Department of Justice for action. You see what a serious thing it is." Bill Longley was leaning his lengthy, slowly moving frame back in his swivel chair. His hands were clasped behind his head, and he turned a little to look the examiner in the face. The examiner was surprised to see a smile creep about the rugged mouth of the banker and a kindly twinkle in his light blue eyes. If he saw the seriousness of the affair, it did not show in his countenance. "Of course, you don't know Tom Merwin," said Longley almost genially. "Yes, I know about that loan. It hadn't any security except Tom Merwin's word. Somehow I've always found that when a man's word is good, it's the best security there is. Oh, yes, I know the government doesn't think so. I guess I'll see Tom about that note." Mr. Todd's dyspepsia seemed to grow suddenly worse. He looked at the chaparral banker through his double magnifying glasses in amazement. "You see," said Longley, easily explaining the thing away, "Tom heard of 2,000 head of 2-year-olds down near Rocky Ford on the Rio Grande that could be had for $8 a head. I reckon 'twas one of old Leandro Garcia's outfits that he had smuggled over, and he wanted to make a quick turn on 'em. Those cattle are worth $15 on the hoof in Kansas City. Tom knew it, and I knew it. He had 6,000, and I let him have the 10,000 to make the deal with. His brother Ed took 'em on to market 3 weeks ago. He ought to be back most any day now with the money. When it comes, Tom will pay that note." The bank examiner was shocked. It was perhaps his duty to step out to the telegraph office and wire the situation to the comptroller, but he did not. He talked pointedly and effectively to Longley for 3 minutes. He succeeded in making the banker understand that he stood upon the border of a catastrophe, and then he offered a tiny loophole of escape. "I am going to Hilldale's tonight," he told Longley, "to examine a bank there. I will pass through Chaparosa on my way back. At 12 o'clock tomorrow I shall call at this bank. If this loan has been cleared out of the way by that time, it will not be mentioned in my report. If not, I will have to do my duty." With that, the examiner bowed and departed. The president of the First National lounged in his chair half an hour longer, and then he lit a mild cigar and went over to Tom Merwin's house. Merwin, a ranchman in duck brown with a contemplative eye, sat with his feet upon a table, plating a rawhide quirt. "Tom," said Longley, leaning against the table, "you heard anything from Ed yet?" "Not yet," said Merwin, continuing his plating. "I guess Ed'll be along back now in a few days." "There was a bank examiner," said Longley, "nosing around our place today, and he bucked a sight about that note of yours. You know I know it's all right, but the thing is against the banking laws. I was pretty sure you'd have paid it off before the bank was examined again, but the son of a gun slipped in on us, Tom. Now, I'm short of cash myself just now, or I'd let you have the money to take it up with. I've got till 12 o'clock tomorrow, and then I've got to show the cash in place of that note, or what, Bill?" asked Merwin, as Longley hesitated. "Well, I suppose it means be jumped on with both of Uncle Sam's feet. I'll try to raise the money for you on time," said Merwin, interested in his plating. "All right, Tom," concluded Longley as he turned toward the door. "I knew you would if you could." Merwin threw down his whip and went to the only other bank in town, a private one run by Cooper and Craig. "Cooper," he said to the partner by that name, "I've got to have $10,000 a day or tomorrow. I've got a house and lot there that's worth about $6,000, and that's all the actual collateral. But I've got a cattle deal on that's sure to bring me in more than that much profit within a few days." Cooper began to cough. "Now, for God's sake, don't say no," said Merwin. "I owe that much money on a call loan. It's been called, and the man that called it is a man I've laid on the same blanket with on cow camps and ranger camps for 10 years. He can call anything I've got. He can call the blood out of my veins and it'll come. He's got to have the money. He's in a devil of... Well, he needs the money, and I've got to get it for him. You know my word's good, Cooper." "No doubt about it," assented Cooper urbanely, "but I've a partner, you know. I'm not free in making loans. And if you had the best security in your hands, Merwin, we couldn't accommodate you in less than a week. We're just making a shipment of $15,000 to Mayer Brothers in Rockdale to buy cotton with. It goes down on the narrow gauge tonight. That leaves our cash quite short at present. Sorry we can't arrange it for you." Merwin went back to his little bare office and played it at his quirt again. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he went to the First National Bank and leaned over the railing of Longley's desk. "I'll try to get that money for you tomorrow, Bill." "All right, Tom," said Longley quietly. At 9 o'clock that night, Tom Merwin stepped cautiously out of the small frame house in which he lived. It was near the edge of the little town, and few citizens were in the neighborhood at that hour. Merwin wore 2 six-shooters in a belt and a slouch hat. He moved swiftly down a lonely street and then followed the sandy road that ran parallel to the narrow-gauge track until he reached the water tank 2 miles below the town. There Tom Merwin stopped, tied a black silk handkerchief about the lower part of his face, and pulled his hat down low. In 10 minutes, the night train for Rockdale pulled up at the tank, having come from Chaparrosa. With a gun in each hand, Merwin raised himself from behind a clump of chaparral and started for the engine. But before he had taken 3 steps, 2 long, strong arms clasped him from behind, and he was lifted from his feet and thrown face downward upon the grass. There was a heavy knee pressing against his back and an iron hand grasping each of his wrists. It was held thus, like a child, until the engine had taken water and until the train had moved, with accelerating speed, out of sight. Then he was released and rose to his feet to face Bill Longley. "The case never needed to be fixed up this way, Tom," said Longley. "I saw Cooper this evening, and he told you what you and him talked about. Then I went down to your house tonight and saw you come out with your guns on, and I followed you. Let's go back, Tom." They walked away together, side by side. "'Twas the only chance I saw," said Merwin presently. "You called your loan, and I tried to answer you. Now what'll you do, Bill, if they sock it to you?" "What would you do if they'd socked it to you?" was the answer Longley made. "I never thought I'd lay in a bush to stick up a train," remarked Merwin. "But a call loan's different. A call's a call with me. We've got 12 hours yet, Bill, before this spy jumps onto you. We've got to raise them spondulicks somehow. Maybe we can—" "Great Sam Houston, do you hear that?" Merwin broke into a run, and Longley kept with him, hearing only a rather pleasing whistle somewhere in the night rendering a lugubrious air of the cowboy's lament. "It's the only tune he knows," shouted Merwin as he ran. "I'll bet—" They were at the door of Merwin's house. He kicked it open and fell over an old valise lying in the middle of the floor. A sunburned, firm-jawed youth, stained by travel, lay upon the bed, puffing at a brown cigarette. "What's the word, Ed?" gasped Merwin. So, drawled that capable youngster. "Just got in on the 9:30. Sold the bunch for 15 straight. Now, buddy, you want to quit kicking a valise around that's got $29,000 in greenbacks in its innards?" The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky by Stephen Crane. The great Pullman was whirling onward with such dignity of motion that a glance from the window seemed simply to prove that the plains of Texas were pouring eastward. Vast flats of green grass, dull-hued spaces of mesquite and cactus, little groups of frame houses, woods of light and tender trees, all were sweeping into the east, sweeping over the horizon, a precipice. A newly married pair had boarded this coach at San Antonio. The man's face was reddened from many days in the wind and sun, and a direct result of his new black clothes was that his brick-colored hands were constantly performing in a most conscious fashion. From time to time he looked down respectfully at his attire. He sat with a hand on each knee, like a man waiting in a barber's shop. The glances he devoted to other passengers were furtive and shy. The bride was not pretty, nor was she very young. She wore a dress of blue cashmere, with small reservations of velvet here and there and with steel buttons abounding. She continually twisted her head to regard her puff sleeves, very stiff, straight, and high. They embarrassed her. It was quite apparent that she had cooked, and she expected to cook dutifully. The blushes caused by the careless scrutiny of some passengers as she had entered the car were strange to see upon this plain underclass countenance, which was drawn in placid, almost emotionless lines. They were evidently very happy. "Ever been in a parlor car before?" he asked, smiling with delight. "No," she answered. "I never was. It's fine, ain't it?" "Great. And then after a while we'll go forward to the diner and get a big layout. Finest meal in the world. Charge $1. "Oh, do they?" cried the bride. "Charge $1? Why, that's too much for us, ain't it, Jack?" "Not this trip, anyhow," he answered bravely. "We're going to go the whole thing." Later he explained to her about the trains. "You see, it's 1,000 miles from one end of Texas to the other, and this train runs right across it and never stops but 4 times. He had the pride of an owner. He pointed out to her the dazzling fittings of the coach, and in truth her eyes opened wider as she contemplated the sea-green figured velvet, the shining brass, silver, and glass, the wood that gleamed as darkly brilliant as the surface of a pool of oil. At one end a bronze figure sturdily held a support for a separated chamber, and at convenient places on the ceiling were frescoes in olive and silver. To the minds of the pair, their surroundings reflected the glory of their marriage that morning in San Antonio. This was the environment of their new estate, and the man's face in particular beamed with an elation that made him appear ridiculous to the porter. This individual at times surveyed them from afar with an amused and superior grin. On other occasions he bullied them with skill in ways that did not make it exactly plain to them that they were being bullied. He subtly used all the manners of the most unconquerable kind of snobbery. He oppressed them, but of this oppression they had small knowledge, and they speedily forgot that infrequently a number of passengers covered them with stares of derisive enjoyment. Historically, there was supposed to be something infinitely humorous in their situation. "We're due in Yellow Sky at 3:42, he said, looking tenderly into her eyes. "Oh, are we?" she said, as if she had not been aware of it. To evince surprise at her husband's statement was part of her wifely amiability. She took from a pocket a little silver watch, and as she held it before her and stared at it with a frown of attention, the new husband's face shone. "I bought it in San Antone from a friend of mine," he told her gleefully. "It's 17 minutes past 12, she said, looking up at him with a kind of shy and clumsy coquetry. A passenger, noting this play, grew excessively sardonic and winked at himself in one of the numerous mirrors. At last they went to the dining car. 2 rows of waiters in glowing white suits surveyed their entrance with the interest and also the equanimity of men who had been forewarned. The pair fell to the lot of a waiter who happened to feel pleasure in steering them through their meal. He viewed them with the manner of a fatherly pilot, his countenance radiant with benevolence. The patronage, entwined with the ordinary deference, was not plain to them, and yet as they returned to their coach, they showed in their faces a sense of escape. To the left, miles down a long purple slope, was a little ribbon of mist where moved the keening Rio Grande. The train was approaching it at an angle, and the apex was Yellow Sky. Presently it was apparent that as the distance from Yellow Sky grew shorter, the husband became commensurately restless. His brick-red hands were more insistent in their prominence. Occasionally he was even rather absent-minded and far away when the bride leaned forward and addressed him. As a matter of truth, Jack Potter was beginning to find the shadow of a deed weigh upon him like a leaden slab. He, the town marshal of Yellow Sky, a man known, liked, and feared in his corner, a prominent person, had gone to San Antonio to meet a girl he believed he loved, and there, after the usual prayers, had actually induced her to marry him, without consulting Yellow Sky for any part of the transaction. He was now bringing his bride before an innocent and unsuspecting community. Of course, people in Yellow Sky married as it pleased them, in accordance with a general custom, but such was Potter's thought of his duty to his friends, or of their idea of his duty, or of an unspoken form which does not control men in these matters, that he felt he was heinous. He had committed an extraordinary crime. Face to face with this girl in San Antonio, and spurred by his sharp impulse, he had gone headlong over all the social hedges. At San Antonio he was like a man hidden in the dark. A knife to sever any friendly duty, any form, was easy to his hand in that remote city. But the hour of Yellow Sky, the hour of daylight, was approaching. He knew full well that his marriage was an important thing to his town. It could only be exceeded by the burning of the new hotel. His friends could not forgive him. Frequently he had reflected on the advisability of telling them by telegraph, but a new cowardice had been upon him. He feared to do it. And now the train was hurrying him toward a scene of amazement, glee, and reproach. He glanced out of the window at the line of haze swinging slowly in towards the train. Yellow Sky had a kind of brass band which played painfully to the delight of the populace. He laughed without heart as he thought of it. If the citizens could dream of his prospective arrival with his bride, they would parade the band at the station and escort them amid cheers and laughing congratulations to his adobe home. He resolved that he would use all the devices of speed and plainscraft in making the journey from the station to his house. Once within the safe citadel, he would issue some sort of a vocal bulletin and then not go among the citizens until they had time to wear off a little of their enthusiasm. The bride looked anxiously at him. "What's worrying you, Jack?" He laughed again. "I'm not worrying, girl. I'm only thinking of Yellow Sky." She flushed in comprehension. A sense of mutual guilt invaded their minds and developed a finer tenderness. They looked at each other with eyes softly aglow, but Potter often laughed the same nervous laugh. The flush upon the bride's face seemed quite permanent. The traitor to the feelings of Yellow Sky narrowly watched the speeding landscape. "We're nearly there," he said. Presently the porter came and announced the proximity of Potter's home. He held a brush in his hand, and with all his airy superiority gone, he brushed Potter's new clothes as the latter slowly turned this way and that way. Potter fumbled out a coin and gave it to the porter, as he had seen others do. It was a heavy and muscle-bound business, as that of a man shoeing his first horse. The porter took their bag, and as the train began to slow, they moved forward to the hooded platform of the car. Presently, the two engines and their long string of coaches rushed into the station of Yellow Sky. "They have to take water here," said Potter from a constricted throat and in mournful cadence, as one announcing death. Before the train stopped, his eye had swept the length of the platform, and he was glad and astonished to see that there was none upon it but the station agent, who, with a slightly hurried and anxious air, was walking toward the water tanks. When the train had halted, the porter alighted first and placed in position a little temporary step. "Come on, girl," said Potter hoarsely. As he helped her down, they each laughed on a false note. He took the bag from the porter and bade his wife cling to his arm. As they slunk rapidly away, his hangdog glance perceived that they were unloading the two trunks, and also that the station agent far ahead, near the baggage car, had turned and was running toward him, making gestures. He laughed and groaned as he laughed when he noted the first effect of his marital bliss upon Yellow Sky. He gripped his wife's arm firmly to his side, and they fled. Behind them, the porter stood chuckling fatuously. The California Express on the Southern Railway was due at Yellow Sky in 21 minutes. There were 6 men at the bar of the Weary Gentleman's Saloon. One was a drummer who talked a great deal and rapidly. 3 were Texans who did not care to talk at that time, and 2 were Mexican sheep herders who did not talk as a general practice in the Weary Gentleman's Saloon. The barkeeper's dog lay on the boardwalk that crossed in front of the door. His head was on his paws, and he glanced drowsily here and there with the constant vigilance of a dog that is kicked on occasion. Across the sandy street were some vivid green grass plots, so wonderful in appearance amid the sands that burned near them in a blazing sun that they caused a doubt in the mind. They exactly resembled the grass mats used to represent lawns on the stage. At the cooler end of the railway station, a man without a coat sat in a tilted chair and smoked his pipe. The fresh-cut bank of the Rio Grande circled near the town, and there could be seen beyond it a great, plum-colored plain of mesquite. Save for the busy drummer and his companions in the saloon, Yellow Sky was dozing. The newcomer leaned gracefully upon the bar and recited many tales with the confidence of a bard who has come upon a new field. And at that moment that old man fell down the stairs with the bureau in his arms. The old woman was coming up with 2 scuttles of coal, and, of course, the drummer's tale was interrupted by a young man who suddenly appeared in the open door. He cried, "Scratchy Wilson's drunk and is turned loose with both hands." The 2 Mexicans at once set down their glasses and faded out the rear entrance of the saloon. The drummer, innocent and jocular, answered, "All right, old man, suppose he has. Come in and have a drink anyhow." But the information had made such an obvious cleft in every skull in the room that the drummer was obliged to see its importance. All had become instantly solemn. "Say," said he, mystified, "what is this?" His 3 companions made the introductory gesture of eloquent speech, but the young man at the door forestalled them. "It means, my friend," he answered as he came into the saloon, "that for the next 2 hours this town won't be a health resort." The barkeeper went to the door and locked and barred it. Reaching out of the window, he pulled in heavy wooden shutters and barred them. Immediately a solemn, chapel-like gloom was upon the place. The drummer was looking from one to another. "But say," he cried, "what is this, anyhow? You don't mean to say there's going to be a gunfight?" "Don't know whether there'll be a fight or not," answered one man grimly, "but there'll be some shooting, some good shooting." The young man who had warned them waved his hand. "Oh, there'll be fight fast enough if anyone wants it. Anybody can get a fight out there in the street. There's a fight just waiting." The drummer seemed to be swayed between the interest of a foreigner and a perception of personal danger. "What did you say his name was?" he asked. "Scratchy Wilson," they answered in chorus. "And will he kill anybody? What are you going to do? Does this happen often? Does he rampage around like this once a week or so? Can he break in that door?" "No, he can't break down that door," replied the barkeeper. "He's tried it 3 times. But when he comes, you'd better lay down on the floor, stranger. He's dead sure to shoot at it, and a bullet may come through." Thereafter the drummer kept a strict eye upon the door. The time had not yet been called for him to hug the floor, but as a minor precaution, he sidled near the wall. "Will he kill anybody?" he said again. The men laughed low and scornfully at the question. "He's out to shoot and he's out for trouble. Don't see any good in experimenting with him." "But what do you do in a case like this? What do you do?" A man responded. "Why, he and Jack Potter—" "But," in chorus the other men interrupted, "Jack Potter's in San Antone." "Well, who is he? What's he got to do with it?" "Oh, he's the town marshal. He goes out and fights Scratchy when he gets on one of these tears." "Wow," said the drummer, mopping his brow. "Nice job he's got." The voices had toned away to mere whisperings. The drummer wished to ask further questions, which were born of an increasing anxiety and bewilderment, but when he attempted them, the men merely looked at him in irritation and motioned him to remain silent. A tense, waiting hush was upon them. In the dense shadows of the room, their eyes shone as they listened for sounds from the street. One man made 3 gestures at the barkeeper, and the latter, moving like a ghost, handed him a glass and a bottle. The man poured a full glass of whiskey and set down the bottle noiselessly. He gulped the whiskey in a swallow and turned again toward the door in immovable silence. The drummer saw that the barkeeper, without a sound, had taken a Winchester from beneath the bar. Later he saw this individual beckoning to him, so he tiptoed across the floor. "You better come with me to the back of the bar." "No, thanks," said the drummer, perspiring. "I'd rather be where I can make a break for the back door." Whereupon the man of bottles made a kindly but peremptory gesture. The drummer obeyed it, and finding himself seated on a box with his head below the level of the bar, balm was laid upon his soul at the sight of various zinc and copper fittings that bore a resemblance to armor plate. The barkeeper took a seat comfortably upon an adjacent box. "You see," he whispered, "this here Scratchy Wilson is a wonder with a gun, a perfect wonder, and when he goes on the war trail we hunt our holes naturally. He's about the last one of the old gang that used to hang out along the river here. He's a terror when he's drunk. When he's sober he's all right, kind of simple, wouldn't hurt a fly, nicest fellow in town. But when he's drunk, woo!" There were periods of stillness. "I wish Jack Potter was back from San Antone," said the barkeeper. "He shot Wilson up once, in the leg. I need to sail in and pull out the kinks in this thing." Presently they heard from a distance the sound of a shot, followed by 3 wild yowls. It instantly removed a bond from the man in the darkened saloon. There was a shuffling of feet. They looked at each other. "Here he comes," they said. A man in a maroon-colored flannel shirt, which had been purchased for purposes of decoration and made principally by some Jewish women on the east side of New York, rounded a corner and walked into the middle of the main street of Yellow Sky. In either hand the man held a long, heavy, blue-black revolver. Often he yelled, and these cries rang through a semblance of a deserted village, shrilly flying over the roofs in a volume that seemed to have no relation to the ordinary vocal strength of a man. It was as if the surrounding stillness formed the arch of a tomb over him. These cries of ferocious challenge rang against walls of silence. And his boots had red tops with gilded imprints, of the kind beloved in winter by little sledding boys on the hillsides of New England. The man's face flamed in a rage begot of whiskey. His eyes, rolling and yet keen for ambush, hunted the still doorways and windows. He walked with the creeping movement of the midnight cat. As it occurred to him, he roared menacing information. The 2 long revolvers in his hands were as easy as straws. They were moved with an electric swiftness. The little fingers of each hand played something in a musician's way. Plain from the low collar of the shirt, the cords of his neck straightened and sank as passion moved him. The only sounds were his terrible invitations. The calm adobes preserved their demeanor at the passing of this small thing in the middle of the street. There was no offer of fight. No offer of fight. The man called to the sky. There were no attractions. He bellowed and fumed and swayed his revolvers here and everywhere. The dog of the barkeeper of the weary gentleman's saloon had not appreciated the advance of events. He yet lay dozing in front of his master's door. At the sight of the dog, the man paused and raised his revolver humorously. At the sight of the man, the dog sprang up and walked diagonally away, with a sullen head and growling. The man yelled, and the dog broke into a gallop. As it was about to enter an alley, there was a loud noise, a whistling, and something spat the ground directly before it. The dog screamed, and wheeling in terror, galloped headlong in a new direction. Again there was a noise, a whistling, and sand was kicked viciously before it. Fear-stricken, the dog turned and hurried like an animal in a pen. The man stood laughing, his weapons at his hips. Ultimately, the man was attracted by the closed door of the weary gentleman's saloon. He went to it, and hammering with a revolver, demanded drink. The door remaining imperturbable, he picked a bit of paper from the walk and nailed it to the framework with a knife. He then turned his back contemptuously upon this popular resort, and walking to the opposite side of the street, and spinning there on his heel quickly and lithely, fired at the bit of paper. He missed it by half an inch. He swore at himself and went away. Later, he comfortably fusilladed the windows of his most intimate friend. The man was playing with this town. It was a toy for him. But still there was no offer of fight. The name of Jack Potter, his ancient antagonist, entered his mind, and he concluded that it would be a glad thing if he should go to Potter's house and by bombardment induce him to come out and fight. He moved in the direction of his desire, chanting Apache scout music. When he arrived at it, Potter's house presented the same still front as had the other adobes. Taking up a strategic position, the man howled a challenge. But this house regarded him as a great stone god. It gave no sign. After a decent wait, the man howled further challenges, mingling them with wonderful epithets. Presently there came the spectacle of a man churning himself into deepest rage over the immobility of a house. He fumed at it as the winter wind attacks a prairie cabin in the north. To the distance there should have gone the sound of a tumult like the fighting of 200 Mexicans. As necessity bade him, he paused for breath or to reload his revolvers. Potter and his bride walked sheepishly and with speed. Sometimes they laughed together, shamefacedly and low. "Next corner, dear," he said finally. They put forth the efforts of a pair walking bowed against a strong wind. Potter was about to raise a finger to point the first appearance of the new home when, as they circled the corner, they came face to face with a man in a maroon-colored shirt who was feverishly pushing cartridges into a large revolver. Upon the instant, the man dropped his revolver to the ground and like lightning whipped another from its holster. The second weapon was aimed at the bridegroom's chest. There was silence. Potter's mouth seemed to be merely a grave for his tongue. He exhibited an instinct to at once loosen his arm from the woman's grip, and he dropped the bag to the sand. As for the bride, her face had gone as yellow as old cloth. She was a slave to hideous rites, gazing at the apparitional snake. The two men faced each other at a distance of 3 paces. He of the revolver smiled with a new and quiet ferocity. "Tried to sneak up on me," he said. "Tried to sneak up on me." His eyes grew more baleful. As Potter made a slight movement, the man thrust his revolver venomously forward. "No, you don't do it, Jack Potter. Don't you move a finger toward a gun just yet. Don't you move an eyelash. The time has come for me to settle with you, and I'm going to do it my way and loaf along with no interfering. So if you don't want a gun bent on you, just mind what I tell you." Potter looked at his enemy. "I ain't got a gun on me, Scratchy," he said. "Honest, I ain't." He was stiffening and steadying, but yet somewhere in the back of his mind a vision of the Pullman floated, the sea-green figured velvet, the shining brass, silver, and glass, the wood that gleamed as darkly brilliant as the surface of a pool of oil, all the glory of the marriage, the environment of the new estate. "You know, I fight when it comes to fighting, Scratcher Wilson, but I ain't got no gun on me. You'll have to do all the shooting yourself." His enemy's face went livid. He stepped forward and lashed his weapon to and fro before Potter's chest. "Don't you tell me you ain't got no gun on you, you whelp. Don't tell me no lie like that. There ain't a man in Texas ever seen you without no gun. Don't take me for no kid." His eyes blazed with light, and his throat worked like a pump. "I ain't taking you for no kid," answered Potter. His heels had not moved an inch backward. "I'm taking you for a fool. I tell you I ain't got no gun, and I ain't. If you're going to shoot me up, you better begin now. You never get a chance like this again." So much enforced reasoning had told on Wilson's rage. He was calmer. "If you ain't got a gun, why ain't you got a gun?" he sneered. "Been to Sunday school?" "I ain't got a gun because I've just come from San Antone with my wife. I'm married," said Potter. "And if I'd thought there was going to be any galoots like you prowling around when I brought my wife home, I'd have had a gun, and don't you forget it." "Married?" said Scratchy, not at all comprehending. "Yes, married. I'm married," said Potter distinctly. "Married?" said Scratchy. Seemingly for the first time he saw the drooping, drowning woman at the other side. "No," he said. He was like a creature allowed a glimpse of another world. He moved a pace backward, and his arm with the revolver dropped to his side. "Is this the lady?" he asked. "Yes, this is the lady," answered Potter. There was another period of silence. "Well," said Wilson at last, slowly, "I suppose it's all off now." "It's all off if you say so, Scratchy. You know I didn't make the trouble." Potter lifted his valise. "Well, I allow it's off, Jack," said Wilson. He was looking at the ground. "Married." He was not a student of chivalry. It was merely that in the presence of this foreign condition he was a simple child of the earlier plains. He picked up his starboard revolver, and placing both weapons in their holsters, he went away. His feet made funnel-shaped tracks in the heavy sand. The Ransom of Red Chief by O. Henry. It looked like a good thing, but wait till I tell you. We were down south in Alabama, Bill Driscoll and myself, when this kidnapping idea struck us. It was, as Bill afterward expressed it, during a moment of temporary mental apparition. But we didn't find that out till later. There was a town down there as flat as a flannel cake and called Summit, of course. It contained inhabitants of as undeleterious and self-satisfied a class of peasantry as ever clustered around a maypole. Bill and me had a joint capital of about $600, and we needed just $2,000 more to pull off a fraudulent town lot scheme in western Illinois with. We talked it over on the front steps of the hotel. Philoprogenitiveness, says we, is strong in semi-rural communities. Therefore, and for other reasons, a kidnapping project ought to do better there than in the radius of newspapers that send reporters out in plain clothes to stir up talk about such things. We knew that Summit couldn't get after us with anything stronger than constables and maybe some lackadaisical bloodhounds and a diatribe or two in the weekly farmer's budget, so it looked good. We selected for our victim the only child of a prominent citizen named Ebenezer Dorset. The father was respectable and tight, a mortgage fancier and a stern, upright collection plate passer and forecloser. The kid was a boy of 10, with bas-relief freckles and hair the color of the cover of the magazine you buy at the newsstand when you want to catch a train. Bill and me figured that Ebenezer would melt down for a ransom of $2,000 to a cent. But wait till I tell you. About 2 miles from Summit was a little mountain covered with a dense cedar brake. On the rear elevation of this mountain was a cave. There we stored provisions. One evening after sundown, we drove in a buggy past old Dorset's house. The kid was in the street, throwing rocks at a kitten on the opposite fence. "Hey, little boy," says Bill, "would you like to have a bag of candy and a nice ride?" The boy catches Bill neatly in the eye with a piece of brick. "That'll cost old man an extra $500, says Bill, climbing over the wheel. That boy put up a fight like a welterweight cinnamon bear, but at last we got him down in the bottom of the buggy and drove away. We took him up to the cave, and I hitched the horse in the cedar brake. After dark, I drove the buggy to the little village 3 miles away where we had hired it, and walked back to the mountain. Bill was pasting court plaster over the scratches and bruises on his features. There was a fire burning behind the big rock at the entrance of the cave, and the boy was watching a pot of boiling coffee, with 2 buzzard tail feathers stuck in his red hair. He points a stick at me when I come up and says, "Ha! Cursed paleface! Do you dare to enter the camp of Red Chief, the terror of the plains?" "He's all right now," says Bill, rolling up his trousers and examining some bruises on his shins. "We're playing Indian. We're making Buffalo Bill's show look like magic lantern views of Palestine in the town hall. I'm old Hank, the trapper, Red Chief's captive, and I'm to be scalped at daybreak. By Geronimo, that kid can kick hard." Yes, sir. That boy seemed to be having the time of his life. The fun of camping out in a cave had made him forget that he was a captive himself. He immediately christened me Snake Eye the Spy, and announced that when his braves returned from the warpath, I was to be broiled at the stake at the rising of the sun. And then we had supper, and he filled his mouth full of bacon and bread and gravy and began to talk. He made a during-dinner speech something like this. "I like this fine. I never camped out before, but I had a pet possum once, and I was 9 last birthday. I hate to go to school. Rats ate up 16 of Jimmy Talbot's aunt's speckled hen's eggs. Are there any real Indians in these woods? I want some more gravy. Does the trees move and make the wind blow? We had 5 puppies. What makes your nose so red, Hank? My father has lots of money. Are the stars hot? I whipped Ed Walker twice Saturday. I don't like girls. You dasn't catch toads unless with a string. Do oxen make any noise? Why are oranges round? Have you got beds to sleep on in this cave? Amos Murray has got 6 toes. A parrot can talk, but a monkey or fish can't. How many does it take to make 12? Every few minutes he would remember that he was a pesky redskin and pick up his stick rifle and tiptoe to the mouth of the cave to rubber for the scouts of the hated paleface. Now and then he would let out a war whoop that made old Hank the Trapper shiver. That boy had Bill terrorized from the start. "Red Chief," says I to the kid, "would you like to go home?" "Aw, what for?" says he. "I don't have any fun at home. I hate to go to school. I like to camp out. You won't take me back again, Snake Eye, will ya?" "Not right away," says I. "We'll stay here in the cave a while." "All right," says he. "That'll be fine. I never had such fun in all my life." We went to bed around 11 o'clock. We spread down some wide blankets and quilts and put Red Chief between us. We weren't afraid he'd run away. He kept us awake for 3 hours, jumping up and reaching for his rifle and screeching, "Sst, Bart," in mine and Bill's ears, and as the fancied crackle of a twig or the rustle of a leaf revealed to his young imagination the stealthy approach of the outlaw band. At last I fell into a troubled sleep, and I dreamed that I had been kidnapped and chained to a tree by a ferocious pirate with red hair. Just at daybreak, I was awakened by a series of awful screams from Bill. They weren't yells or howls or shouts or whoops or yelps, such as you'd expect from a manly set of vocal organs. They were simply indecent, terrifying, humiliating screams, such as women emit when they see ghosts or caterpillars. It's an awful thing to hear a strong, desperate, fat man scream incontinently in a cave at daybreak. I jumped up to see what the matter was. Red Chief was sitting on Bill's chest, with one hand twined in Bill's hair. In the other, he had a sharp case knife we used for slicing bacon, and he was industriously and realistically trying to take Bill's scalp, according to the sentence that had been pronounced upon him the evening before. I got the knife away from the kid and made him lie down again. But from that moment, Bill's spirit was broken. He laid down on his side of the bed, but he never closed an eye again in sleep as long as that boy was with us. I dozed off for a while, but along toward sunup I remembered that Red Chief had said I was to be burned at the stake at the rising of the sun. I wasn't nervous or afraid, but I sat up and lit my pipe and leaned against a rock. "What are you getting up so soon for, Sam?" asked Bill. "Me?" says I. "Oh, I got kind of a pain in my shoulder. I thought sitting up would rest it." "You're a liar," says Bill. "You're afraid. You was to be burned at sunrise, and you was afraid he'd do it. And he would, too, if he could find a match. Ain't it awful, Sam? You think anybody'll pay out money to get a little imp like that back home?" "Sure," said I. "A rowdy little kid like that is just the kind that parents dote on. Now you and the chief get up and cook breakfast, while I go up on top of this mountain and reconnoiter." I went up to the peak of the little mountain and ran my eye over the contiguous vicinity. Over toward summit I expected to see the sturdy yeomanry of the village armed with scythes and pitchforks, beating the countryside for the dastardly kidnappers. But what I saw was a peaceful landscape, dotted with one man plowing with a dun mule. Nobody was dragging the creek. No couriers dashed hither and yon, bringing tidings of no news to the distracted parents. There was a sylvan attitude of somnolent sleepiness pervading that section of the external outward surface of Alabama that lay exposed to my view. Perhaps, says I to myself, it has not yet been discovered that the wolves have borne away the tender lambkin from the fold. Heaven help the wolves, says I, and I went down the mountain to breakfast. When I got to the cave, I found Bill backed up against the side of it, breathing hard, and the boy threatening to smash him with a rock half as big as a coconut. "He put a red-hot boiled potato down my back," explained Bill, "and then mashed it with his foot. and I boxed his ears. Have you got a gun about you, Sam?" I took the rock away from the boy and kind of patched up the argument. "I'll fix you," said the kid to Bill. "No man ever yet struck the Red Chief but what he got paid for it. You better beware." After breakfast, the kid takes a piece of leather with strings wrapped around it out of his pocket and goes outside the cave unwinding it. "What's he up to now?" says Bill anxiously. "You don't think he'll run away, do you, Sam?" "No fear of it," says I. "He don't seem to be much of a homebody, but we've got to fix up some plan about the ransom. There don't seem to be much excitement around Summit on account of his disappearance, but maybe they haven't realized yet that he's gone. His folks may think he's spending the night with Aunt Jane or one of the neighbors. Anyhow, he'll be missed today. Tonight we must get a message to his father demanding the $2,000 for his return." Just then we heard a kind of war whoop, such as David might have emitted when he knocked out the champion Goliath. It was a sling that Red Chief had pulled out of his pocket, and he was whirling it around his head. I dodged and heard a heavy thud and kind of a sigh from Bill, like a horse gives out when you take his saddle off. A rock the size of an egg had caught Bill just behind his left ear. He loosened himself all over and fell in the fire across the frying pan of hot water for washing the dishes. I dragged him out and poured cold water on his head for half an hour. By and by, Bill sits up and feels behind his ear and says, "Sam, do you know who my favorite biblical character is?" "Take it easy," says I. "You'll come to your senses presently." "King Herod," he says. "You won't go away and leave me here alone, will you, Sam?" I went out and caught that boy and shook him until his freckles rattled. "If you don't behave," says I, "I'll take you straight home. Now are you going to be good or not?" "I was only funning," he said sullenly. "I didn't mean to hurt old Hank. But what did he hit me for? I'll behave, Snake Eye, if you won't send me home, and if you let me play the Black Scout today." "I don't know the game," says I. "That's for you and Mr. Bill to decide. He's your playmate for the day. I'm going away for a while on business. Now you come in and make friends with him and say you're sorry for hurting him, or home you go at once." I made him and Bill shake hands, and then I took Bill aside and told him I was going to Poplar Cove, a little village 3 miles from the cave, and find out what I could about how the kidnapping had been regarded in Summit. Also, I thought it best to send a peremptory letter to old man Dorset that day, demanding the ransom and dictating how it should be paid. "You know, Sam," says Bill, "I've stood by you without batting an eye in earthquakes, fire and flood, and poker games, dynamite outrages, police raids, train robberies, and cyclones. I never lost my nerve yet till we kidnapped that 2-legged skyrocket of a kid. He's got me going. You won't leave me long with him, will you, Sam?" "I'll be back sometime this afternoon," says I. "You must keep the boy amused and quiet till I return. And now we'll write the letter to old Dorset." Bill and I got paper and pencil and worked on the letter while Red Chief, with a blanket wrapped around him, strutted up and down, guarding the mouth of the cave. Bill begged me, tearfully, to make the ransom $1,500 instead of $2,000. "I ain't attempting," says he, "to decry the celebrated moral aspect of parental affection, but we're dealing with humans, and it ain't human for anybody to give up $2,000 for that 40-pound chunk of freckled wildcat. I'm willing to take a chance of $1,500. You can charge the difference to me." So, to relieve Bill, I acceded, and we collaborated a letter that ran this way: "Ebenezer Dorset, Esquire, we have your boy concealed in a place far from Summit. It is useless for you or the most skillful detectives to attempt to find him. Absolutely, the only terms on which you can have him restored to you are these. We demand $1,500 in large bills for his return. The money to be left at midnight tonight, at the same spot and in the same box as your reply, as hereinafter described. If you agree to these terms, send your answer in writing by a solitary messenger tonight at 8:30. After crossing Owl Creek, on the road to Poplar Cove, there are 3 large trees about 100 yards apart, close to the fence of the wheat field on the right-hand side. At the bottom of the fence post, opposite the 3rd tree, will be found a small pasteboard box. The messenger will place the answer in this box and return immediately to Summit. If you attempt any treachery or fail to comply with our demand as stated, you will never see your boy again. If you pay the money as demanded, he will be returned to you safe and well within 3 hours. These terms are final, and if you do not accede to them, no further communication will be attempted. 2 desperate men. I addressed this letter to Dorset and put it in my pocket. As I was about to start, the kid comes up to me and says, "Oh, Snake Eye, you said I could play the Black Scout while you was gone." "Play it, of course," says I. "Mr. Bill will play with you. What kind of a game is it?" "I'm the Black Scout," says Red Chief, "and I have to ride to the stockade to warn the settlers that the Indians are coming. I'm tired of playing Indian myself. I want to be the Black Scout." "All right," says I. "Sounds harmless to me. I guess Mr. Bill will help you foil those pesky savages." "What am I to do?" asked Bill, looking at the kid suspiciously. "You are the hoss," says Black Scout. "Get down on your hands and knees. How can I ride to the stockade without a hoss?" "You'd better keep him interested," said I, "till we get the scheme going. Loosen up." Bill gets down on his all fours, and a look comes in his eye like a rabbit's when you catch it in a trap. "How far is it to the stockade, kid?" he asks in a husky manner of voice. 90 miles, says the Black Scout, "and you have to hump yourself to get there on time. Whoa, now!" The Black Scout jumps on Bill's back and digs his heels in his side. "For heaven's sake," says Bill, "hurry back, Sam, soon as you can. I wish we hadn't made that ransom more than 1,000. Say, you quit kicking me or I'll get up and warm you good." I walked over to Poplar Cove and sat around the post office and store, talking with the chawbacons that came in to trade. One whiskerando says that he hears Summit is all upset on account of Elder Ebenezer Dorset's boy having been lost or stolen. That was all I wanted to know. I bought some smoking tobacco, referred casually to the price of black-eyed peas, posted my letter surreptitiously, and came away. The postmaster said the mail carrier would come by in an hour to take the mail on to Summit. When I got back to the cave, Bill and the boy were not to be found. I explored the vicinity of the cave and risked a yodel or two, but there was no response. So I lighted my pipe and sat down on a mossy bank to await developments. In about a half an hour, I heard the bushes rustle, and Bill wobbled out into the little glade in front of the cave. Behind him was the kid, stepping softly like a scout, with a broad grin on his face. Bill stopped, took off his hat, and wiped his face with a red handkerchief. The kid stopped about 8 feet behind him. "Sam," says Bill, "I suppose you'll think I'm a renegade, but I couldn't help it. I'm a grown person with masculine proclivities and habits of self-defense, but there is a time when all systems of egotism and predominance fail. The boy's gone. I have sent him home. All is off. There was martyrs in old times," goes on Bill, "that suffered death rather than give up the particular graft they enjoyed. None of them ever was subjugated to such supernatural tortures as I have been. I've tried to be faithful to our articles of depredation, but there came a limit." "What's the trouble, Bill?" I asks him. "I was rode," says Bill, "the 90 miles to the stockade, not barring an inch. Then, when the settlers was rescued, I was given oats. Sand ain't a palatable substitute. And then, for an hour, I had to explain to him why there was nothing in holes, how a road can run both ways, and what makes the grass green. I tell you, Sam, a human can only stand so much. I takes him by the neck of his clothes and drags him down the mountain. On the way he kicks my legs black and blue from the knees down, and I've got to have 2 or 3 bites on my thumb and hand cauterized. But he's gone," continues Bill, "gone home. I showed him the road to Summit and kicked him about 8 feet near there at one kick. I'm sorry we lose the ransom, but it was either that or Bill Driscoll to the madhouse." Bill is puffing and blowing, but there is a look of ineffable peace and growing contentment on his rose-pink features. "Bill," says I, "there isn't any heart disease in your family, is there?" "No," says Bill, "nothing chronic except malaria and accidents." "Why?" "Then you might turn around," says I, "and have a look behind you." Bill turns and sees the boy and loses his complexion and sits down plump on the ground and begins to pluck aimlessly at grass and little sticks. For an hour I was afraid for his mind. And then I told him that my scheme was to put the whole job through immediately and that we would get the ransom and be off with it by midnight if old Dorset fell in with our proposition. So Bill braced up enough to give the kid a weak sort of smile and a promise to play the Russian and the Japanese war with him as soon as he felt a little better. I had a scheme for collecting that ransom without danger of being caught by counterplots that ought to commend itself to professional kidnappers. It was close to the road fence with big bare fields on all sides. If a gang of constables should be watching for anyone to come for the note, they could see him a long way off crossing the fields or in the road, but no siree. At 8:30 I was up in that tree as well hidden as a tree toad, waiting for the messenger to arrive. Exactly on time, a half-grown boy rides up the road on a bicycle, locates the pasteboard box at the foot of the fence post, slips a folded piece of paper into it, and pedals away again back toward Summit. I waited an hour and then concluded the thing was square. I slid down the tree, got the note, slipped along the fence till I struck the woods, and was back at the cave in another half an hour. I opened the note, got near the lantern, and read it to Bill. It was written with a pen in a crabbed hand, and the sum and substance of it was this. 2 desperate men. Gentlemen, I received your letter today by post in regard to the ransom you ask for the return of my son. I think you are a little high in your demands, and I hereby make you a counter-proposition, which I am inclined to believe you will accept. You bring Johnny home and pay me $250 in cash, and I agree to take him off your hands. You'd better come at night, for the neighbors believe he is lost, and I couldn't be responsible for what they would do to anybody they saw bringing him back. Very respectfully, Ebenezer Dorset. Great pirates of Penzance, says I, of all the impudent— But I glanced at Bill and hesitated. He had the most appealing look in his eyes I ever saw in the face of a dumb or a talking brute. Sam, says he, what's $250 after all? We got the money. One more night of this kid will send me to a bed in Bedlam. Besides being a thorough gentleman, I think Mr. Dorset is a spendthrift for making us such a liberal offer. You ain't going to let the chance go, are you? Tell you the truth, Bill, says I, this little ewe lamb has somewhat got on my nerves, too. We'll take him home, pay the ransom, and make our getaway. We took him home that night. We got him to go by telling him that his father had bought a silver-mounted rifle and a pair of moccasins for him, and we were going to hunt bears the next day. It was just 12 o'clock when we knocked at Ebenezer's front door. Just at the moment when I should have been abstracting the $1,500 from the box under the tree, according to the original proposition, Bill was counting out $250 into Dorset's hand. When the kid found out we were going to leave him at home, he started up a howl like a calliope and fastened himself as tight as a leech to Bill's leg. His father peeled him away gradually like a porous plaster. How long can you hold him? Asked Bill. I'm not as strong as I used to be, says old Dorset, but I think I can promise you 10 minutes. Enough, says Bill. In 10 minutes I shall cross the central, southern, and middle western states and be legging it trippingly for the Canadian border. And as dark as it was, and as fat as Bill was, and a good a runner as I am, he was a good 1.5 miles out of Summit before I could catch up with him. Many visitors to the State House made the mistake of looking upon the governor as the most important personage in the building. They would walk up and down the corridors, hoping for a glimpse of some of the leading officials, when all the while Freckles McGrath, the real character of the Capitol, and by all odds the most illustrious person in it, was at once accessible and affable. Freckles McGrath was the elevator boy. In the official register, his name had gone down as William, but that was a mere concession to the constituents to whom the official register was sent out. In the newspapers, and he appeared with frequency in the newspapers, he was always Freckles, and everyone from the governor down gave him that title, the appropriateness of which was stamped 100-fold upon his shrewd, jolly Irish face. Like everyone else on the state payroll, Freckles was keyed high during this first week of the new session. It was a reform legislature, and so imbued was it with the idea of reforming that there was grave danger of its forcing reformation upon everything in sight. It happened that the governor was of the same faction of the party as that dominant in the legislature. Reform breathed through every nook and crevice of the great building. But high above all else in importance towered the Kelly Bill. From the very opening of the session, there was scarcely a day when some of Freckles' passengers did not, in hushed whispers, mention the Kelly Bill. From what he could pick up about the building and what he read in the newspapers, Freckles put together a few ideas as to what the Kelly Bill really was. It was a great reform measure, and it was going to show the railroads that they did not own the state. The railroads were going to have to pay more taxes, and they were making an awful fuss about it. But if the Kelly Bill could be put through, it would be a great victory for reform, and it would make the governor solid in the state. Freckles McGrath was strong for reform. That was partly because the snatches of speeches he heard in the legislature were more thrilling when for reform than when against it. It was partly because he adored the governor, and in no small part because he despised Mr. Ludlow. Mr. Ludlow was a lobbyist. Some of the members of the legislature were Mr. Ludlow's property, or at least so Freckles inferred from conversation overheard at his post. There had been a great deal of talk that session about Mr. Ludlow's methods. Freckles himself was no snob. Although he had heard Mr. Ludlow called disgraceful, and although he firmly believed he was disgraceful, he did not consider that any reason for not speaking to him. And so, when Mr. Ludlow got in all alone one morning, and the occasion seemed to demand recognition of some sort, Freckles had chirped, "Good morning." But the man, possibly deep in something else, simply knit together his brows and gave no sign of having heard. After that, Henry Ludlow, lobbyist, and Freckles McGrath, elevator boy, were enemies. A little before noon, one day near the end of the session, a member of the Senate and a member of the House rode down together in the elevator. "There's no use waiting any longer," the senator was saying as they got in. "We're as strong now as we're going to be. It's a matter of Stacy's vote, and that's a matter of who sees him last." Freckles widened out his ears and gauged the elevator for very slow running. Stacy had been written up in the papers as a wobbler on the Kelly Bill. "He's all right now," pursued the senator, "but there's every chance that Ludlow will see him before he casts his vote this afternoon, and then, I don't know." And with a weary little flourish of his hands, the senator stepped off. Freckles McGrath sat wrapped in deep thought. The Kelly Bill was coming up in the Senate that afternoon. If Senator Stacy voted for it, it would pass. If he voted against it, it would fail. He would vote for it if he didn't see Mr. Ludlow. He wouldn't vote for it if he did. That was the situation, and the governor's whole future, Freckles felt, was at stake. The bell rang sharply, and he was vaguely conscious then that it had been ringing before. In the next half hour he was very busy taking down the members of the legislature. Strangely enough, Senator Casey and the governor went down the same trip, and Freckles beamed with approbation when he saw them walk out of the building together. Stacy was one of the first of the senators to return. Freckles sized him up keenly as he stepped into the elevator and decided that he was still firm. But there was a look about Senator Stacy's mouth which suggested that there was no use in being too sure of him. Freckles considered the advisability of bursting forth and telling him how much better it would be to stick with the reform fellows. But just as the boy got his courage screwed up to speaking point, Senator Stacy got off. About 10 minutes later, Freckles had the elevator on the ground floor and was sitting there reading a paper when he heard a step that made him prick up his ears. The next minute, Mr. Ludlow turned the corner. He was immaculately dressed, as usual, and his iron-gray mustache seemed to stand out just a little more pompously than ever. There was a sneering look in his eyes as he stepped into the car. It seemed to be saying, "They thought they could beat me, did they? Oh, they're easy, they are." Freckles McGrath slammed the door of the cage and started the car up. He did not know what he was going to do, but he had an idea that he did not want any other passenger. When halfway between the basement and the first floor, he stopped the elevator. He must have time to think. If he took that man up to the Senate chamber, he would simply strike the death blow to reform. And so he knelt and pretended to be fixing something, and he thought fast and hard. "Something broke?" asked an anxious voice. Freckles looked around into Mr. Ludlow's face, and he saw that eminent lobbyist was nervous. "Yes," he said calmly. "It's acting queer. Something's all out of whack." "Well, drop it to the basement and let me out," said Mr. Ludlow sharply. "Can't drop it," responded Freckles. "She's stuck." Mr. Ludlow came and looked things over, but his knowledge did not extend to the mechanism of elevators. "Better call someone to come and take us out," he said nervously. Freckles straightened himself up. A glitter had come into his small gray eyes, and red spots were burning in his freckled cheeks. "I think she'll run now," he said. And she did run. Never in all its history had the State House elevator run as it ran then. It rushed past the first and second floors like a thing let loose, with an utter abandonment that caused the blood to forsake the eminent lobbyist's face. "Stop it, boy!" he cried in alarm. "Can't," responded Freckles, his voice thick with terror. "Running away!" he gasped. "Will it fall?" whispered the lobbyist. I think so," blubbered Freckles. The central portion of the State House was very high. Above that part of the building which was in use there was a long stretch leading to the tower. The shaft had been built clear up, though practically unused. Past floors used for storerooms, past floors used for nothing at all, they went, the man's face white, the boy wailing out incoherent supplications. And then, within 10 feet of the top of the shaft, and within a foot of the top floor of the building, the elevator came to a rickety stop. It wobbled back and forth. It did strange and terrible things. "She's falling!" panted Freckles. "Climb!" And Henry Ludlow climbed. He got the door open and he clambered up. No sooner had the man's feet touched the solid floor than Freckles reached up and slammed the door of the cage. Why he did that he was not sure at the time. Later he felt that something had warned him not to give his prisoner's voice a full sweep down the shaft. Henry Ludlow was far from dull. As he saw the quick but even descent of the car, he knew that he had been tricked. He would have been more than human had there not burst from him furious and threatening words, but what was the use? The car was going down, 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 and there he was, perhaps hundreds and hundreds of feet above anyone else in the building, alone, tricked, beaten. Of course he tried the door at the head of the winding stairway, knowing full well that it would be locked. They always kept it locked. He had heard of one of the janitors asking for the keys to take a party up just a few days before. Perhaps he could get out on top of the building and make signals of distress. But the door leading outside was locked also. There he was, helpless. And below? Well, below they were passing the Kelly bell. He rattled the grating of the elevator shaft. He made strange, loud noises, knowing all the while he could not make himself heard. And then at last, alone in the State House attic, Henry Ludlow, eminent lobbyist, sat down on a box and nursed his fury. Below, Freckles McGrath, the youngest champion of reform in the building, was putting on a bold front. He laughed and he talked and he whistled. He took people up and down with as much nonchalance as if he did not know that at the top of that shaft angry eyes were straining themselves for a glimpse of the car, and terrible curses were descending, literally, upon his stubby red head. It was a great afternoon at the State House. Everyone thronged to the doors of the Senate chamber where they were putting through the Kelly bill. The speeches made in behalf of the measure were brief. The great thing now was not to make speeches. It was to reach S on roll call before a man with iron-gray hair and an iron-gray mustache could come in and say something to the fair-haired member with a weak mouth who sat near the rear of the chamber. Freckles was called away just as it went to a vote. When he came back, Senator Kelly was standing out in the corridor, and a great crowd of men were standing around slapping him on the back. The governor himself was standing on the steps of the Senate chamber. His eyes were bright, and he was smiling. Freckles turned his car back to the basement. He wanted to be all alone for a minute, to dwell in solitude upon the fact that it was he, Freckles McGrath, who had won this great victory for reform. It was he, Freckles McGrath, who had assured the governor's future. Why, perhaps he had that afternoon made for himself a name which would be handed down in the histories. Freckles was a kind little boy, and he knew that an elegant gentleman could not find the attic any too pleasant a place in which to spend the afternoon, so he decided to go up and get Mr. Ludlow. It took courage, but he had won his victory, and this was no time for faltering. There was something gruesome about the long ascent. He thought of stories he had read of lonely turrets in which men were beheaded and otherwise made away with. It seemed he would never come to the top, and when at last he did, it was to find two of the most awful-looking eyes he had ever seen, eyes that looked as though furies were going to escape from them, peering down upon him. The sight of that car, moving smoothly and securely up to the top, and the sight of that audacious little boy with the freckled face and the bat-like eyes, that little boy who had played his game so well, who had wrought such havoc, was too much for Henry Ludlow's self-control. Words such as he had never used before, such as he would not have supposed himself capable of using, burst from him. But Freckles stood calmly gazing up at the infuriated lobbyist. And just as Mr. Ludlow was saying, "I'll beat your head open, you little brat," he calmly reversed the handle and sent the car skimming smoothly to the realms below. He was followed by an angry yell and then by a loud request to return, but he heeded them not, and for some time longer the car made its usual rounds between the basement and the legislative chambers. In just an hour, Freckles tried it again. He sent the car to within 3 feet of the attic floor and then peered through the grating, his face tied in a knot of interrogation. The eminent lobbyist stood there gulping down wrath and pride, knowing well enough that was expected of him. "Oh, all right," he muttered at last, and with that much of an understanding, Freckles sent the car up, opened the door, and Henry Ludlow stepped in. No word was spoken between them until the light from the floor upon which the Senate chamber was situated came in view. Then Freckles turned with a polite inquiry as to where the gentleman wished to get off. "You may take me down to the office of the governor," said Mr. Ludlow stonily, meaningly. "Sure," said Freckles cheerfully. "Guess you'll find the governor in his office now. He's been in the Senate most of the afternoon, watching him pass that Kelly bill." Mr. Ludlow's lips drew in tightly. He squared his shoulders, and his silence was tremendous. In just 15 minutes, Freckles was sent for from the executive office. "I demand his discharge," Mr. Ludlow was saying as the elevator boy entered. "It happens you're not running this building," the governor returned with a good deal of acidity, "though, of course," he added with dignity, "the matter will be carefully investigated." The governor was one great chuckle inside, and his heart was full of admiration and gratitude. But would Freckles be equal to bluffing it through? Would the boy have the finesse, the nice subtlety, the real master hand the situation demanded? If not, then, imp of salvation though he was, in the interest of reform, Freckles would have to be let go. It was a very innocent-looking boy who stood before him and looked inquiringly into his face. "William," began the governor. Freckles was pained at first, and then remembered that officially he was William. "This gentleman has made a very serious charge against you." Freckles looked at Mr. Ludlow in a hurt way and waited for the governor to proceed. "He says," went on the chief executive, "that you deliberately took him to the top of the building and willfully left him there a prisoner all afternoon. Did you do that?" "Oh, sir," burst forth Freckles, "I did the very best I could to save his life. I was willing to sacrifice mine for him. "You little liar," broke in Ludlow. The governor held up his hand. "You had your chance. Let him have his." "You see, Governor," began Freckles, as if anxious to set right a great wrong which had been done him, "the car is acting bad. The engineer said only this morning it needed a going over. When it took that awful shoot, I lost control of it. Maybe I'm to be discharged for losing control of it, but not," Freckles sniffled pathetically, "but not for anything like what he says I done. Why, Governor," he went on, ramming his knuckles into his eyes, "I ain't got nothing against him. What did I take him to the attic for?" "Of course not for money," sneered Mr. Ludlow. The governor turned on him sharply. "When you can bring any proof of that, I'll be ready to hear it. Until you can, you'd better leave it out of the question." "Strange it should have happened this very afternoon," put in the eminent lobbyist. The governor looked at him with an open countenance. "You were especially interested in something this afternoon? I thought you told me you had no vital interest here this session." There was nothing to be said. Mr. Ludlow said nothing. "Now, William," pursued the governor, fearful in his heart that this would be Freckles' undoing, "why did you close the door of the shaft before you started down?" "Well, you see, sir," began Freckles, still tremulously, "I'm so used to closing doors. Closing doors has become kind of second nature with me. I've been told about it so many times. And up there, though I thought I was losing my life, I didn't neglect my duty." The governor put his hand to his mouth and coughed. "And why," he went on, more secure now, for a boy that could get out of that could get out of anything, "why was it you didn't make some immediate effort to get Mr. Ludlow down? Why didn't you notify someone or something about it?" "Why, I supposed, of course, he walked down by the stairs," cried Freckles. "I never dreamed he'd want to trust the elevator after the way she had acted." "The door was locked," snarled the eminent lobbyist. "Well, now, you see, I didn't know that," explained Freckles expansively. "Late in the afternoon, I took a run up just to test the car, and there you were. I was never so surprised in my life. I suppose, of course, sir, that you'd spent the afternoon in the Senate along with everybody else." Once more the governor put his hand to his mouth. "Your case will come before the Executive Council at its next meeting, William, and if anything like this should happen again, you will be discharged on the spot." Freckles bowed. "You may go now." When he was almost at the door, the governor called to him. "Don't you think, William," he said, the governor felt that he and Freckles could afford to be generous, "that you should apologize to the gentleman for the really grave inconvenience to which you have been the means of subjecting him?" Freckles' little gray eyes grew steely. He looked at Henry Ludlow, and there was an ominous silence. Then light broke over his face. "On behalf of the elevator," he said, "I apologize." And a third time the governor's hand was raised to his mouth. The next week, Freckles was wearing a signet ring. Long and audibly had he sighed for a ring of such kind and proportions. He was at some pains in explaining to everyone to whom he showed it that it had been sent to him by a friend up home. You've been listening to The Cultured Bumpkin, a literature podcast with Jake Phillips. Thank you very much for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, would you mind going and subscribing and leaving a nice review on whatever podcast platform you heard this on? I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.